Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And we talk a lot about the games themselves, whether it's their market release, remakes, speed running, anything else. But sometimes it's more than just the game. It's the way we play them, or the devices we use with which we play them.
And there's been a huge variety and kind of splitting point on that over the last decade at least, if not longer. Back in the day, like the Nintendo era, there was, well, I guess even at the time, the Nintendo joypad versus the Atari joystick or the Atari dial controller were hugely different.
Yes, they were. They absolutely were. There was not as much of an agreed upon format in which we interacted with the games themselves. Nowadays, everybody kind of has an agreed upon number of buttons just through, it makes porting easier. It makes things sort of settle down, and it's not quite as lawless or as wild as it once was. And I mean, the joystick went out of vogue and has come back. Things like dials and the Atari paddle and whatnot, those don't go beyond certain kinds of control, but they still pop up every now and again in some really interesting places.
I would say the most consistent peripherals would probably be in the arcade scene. Most video games for arcades would have some semblance of a joystick and a bunch of buttons, whether it's 4, 6, however many.
Absolutely. Or even a physical tactile object, which I guess gets to the first main reason why I see peripherals exist. And that is to draw in and to sell.
Yeah.
So if you are walking around an arcade and you see something that's got a big honkin' machine gun on a put up on a post, you're going to be interested in what that game is shooting at. If you see a huge drum set, you're going to wonder, what things have they've got. If you see two dance pads next to each other with bars behind them, you're going to be curious about that, especially if you've never seen these games before.
Sure.
And if you have seen these games before, they're very easily identifiable. It's the kind of thing where if you see a whole line of similar looking cabinets, you might be going, well, do they have Super Street Fighter? But if you look in and you see those bars, you go, oh, they got a form of DDR. And they've even got different bars, like, okay, that's Dance Dance Revolution. That's Pump It Up. That's In the Groove. That is Dance Stage, and I don't want to touch it. No, there was one that I remember a long time ago that was just this weird mashup of several, and it had like a full 9 buttons on it, and it had some of the best, worst translations of encouragement on it. I think one of them said, "Blast your hidden ardor." ARDOR.
Okay,
which is an English word. And I can see, and it means like passion, and it means everything, but it was one of those kinds of games. I've seen it in only one location. I'm sure it exists elsewhere, and I'm sure somebody knows what this game is. I can't remember. But it is very easily identifiable.
Right.
And, sorry.
No, it's all right. I would say that the interesting thing about the home console market, maybe to jump to the future just for a basis of comparison and how the newest generation of consoles, the Xbox One, the PS4, we're up to 4.
Yes.
Just making sure and reaffirming. And then the Nintendo Switch all have very different control schemes. Safe to say, though, the PlayStation and the Xbox have stayed fairly similar from console to console, from the PS1's second generation analog controllers through now. Minor differences here and there, but more or less the control setup and look is the same. Same with the Xbox. The controllers got a little smaller and more controller-shaped, whatever that means to you. But for the most part, same buttons, same joysticks. Nintendo, however, not so much. They tend to vary probably from system to system all the way back to the Nintendo. But of course, the most recent, the Nintendo Switch, having the controller be the whole system when it's portable, and then when it's at home, the Joy-Cons, which are sort of refined, smaller Wiimotes that aren't Wiimotes anymore, which I think is interesting to make that kind of a change. But to always consistently try and find a unique way to hold the controller and interact with the game. Absolutely.
And, well, it's very funny. There are GIFs online that you can look at that show sort of the like a slide evolution between the consoles and their controllers. Mm-hmm. And just as you said, the PlayStation, I mean, they add stuff, they alter. I mean, there's the touchscreen on it now. Uh-huh. And you can see how clearly one doesn't look like the first one, and they did change, but they're very similar. And same goes for the Xbox. And then I've seen comments that go on the Nintendo one, and it's just going, Wishbone, 2 handles. No, 3, 4. Screw it. A screen. An entire screen in the middle of the controller. And
Yeah. I still say that the Nintendo 64 Wishbone controller is the most comfortable first-person shooter controller ever made.
And there you go. That's really what it comes down to. Comfort and preference.
Yeah.
And people will continue to argue what works and what doesn't work forever.
Yeah.
I don't think you could put down... You could abolish all forms of input save one, and people will argue about how to hold the thing.
That's also true, yeah.
People enjoy having a certain je ne sais quoi and uniqueness about their method of play.
Well, because it also changes how you interact with the game. I mean, to think about the Wii generation, which we all bought in hard on in the beginning.
Yep.
Versus the early PlayStation 2 era is like, or even PlayStation 3, to play Zelda Twilight Princess or Zelda Skyward Sword on the Wii, you had to swing Wiimotes and nunchucks around. You had to use the actual motion control as well as the regular control. There was no option to turn it off.
And there were some interesting times where in the early days, I remember I was following the development of Marvel Ultimate Alliance a great deal because I'm a big X-Men Legends fan. And when they were coming out with the Xbox 360, the PS3, the Wii versions of these things, or however that all falls apart. I think that's what it was. For the Xbox 360, for the PS3, you could, or PS2, I think. No, they had it on both.
It was PS. I believe it was both, but
they
PS3
had both.
generation.
That's what's confusing me so much. They released it on everything conceivable, and they had exclusive characters all the way across. And I was following this, man. It's been years, but I was on it. And whereas those standard buttons and mapping and everything else, the Wii, they tried to, in fact, map certain motions to certain kinds of inputs.
Yeah.
Which was a novel and interesting idea, especially because the motions themselves aren't as big as people want them to be.
Yeah.
Or want to think they are. But it still is a bit of an unwieldy kind of input. And that's sort of at the end of the day, it's a great idea, but it doesn't work for everything.
Well, for my greatest example of that is the Spider-Man 3 game on Wii versus PS3. On the PS3, you press the shoulder button to swing a web. On the Wii version, you flip the nunchuck and then flip the Wiimote to sling webs, which at first seems really cool because you're making the motion Spider-Man would make to sling his webs. However, after playing the game for an hour, your arms are a little tired.
Which shows that a lot of those physical things, there's a reason why you don't play a round of Dance Dance Revolution for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Or half an hour. You're done in 3 songs. Because something very physical like that can only sustain itself for so long. It works for mini games. It works for specific kinds. The Wiimote, when it was first announced, back in the days when it was still for the Nintendo Revolution, the thing that I got most excited about, my first reaction to the entire thing was, okay, it has motion capture. You're able to point it at the screen and a cursor pops up. Oh my God, it makes its own light gun.
Yeah.
And as somebody who loves Area 51, the Point Blank series, Police Trainer, Maximum Force, Elemental Gearbolt,
Time Crisis.
I play I have Die Hard trilogy because I love playing Die Harder. I really, really love light gun games.
Yeah.
And the fact that it doesn't work at all on HD TVs is one of the great losses to me in the march of technology. However, the fact that the Wiimote could allow for that was very exciting. And I really wish they'd made more games that made use of that or really leaned into that style of things. Now, granted, the only thing standing in the way of it being you just pointing a clicker and it being holding the light gun is a piece of plastic.
Sure.
Not even wiring, really, just some mechanical work. But at the time, I don't think they wanted to put forth those kind of violent games or those sort of pieces of violence. So even having an empty shell, I mean, they had that Nyko piece, but nothing was really released in America. In Europe, they released the House of the Dead Overkill hand cannon that looked like an old-style revolver that had been Wiified, which is pretty cool.
Well, yeah, I think that was one of the most interesting things about the Wiimote specifically is how it could be so transformative. Like, I tend to still like traditional controls for Mario Kart game, but it was really cool to snap your remote with no extra wires into a plastic wheel and then drive in Mario Kart.
It's the only way I play Mario Kart on the Wii and beyond.
Yeah.
This also is something I choose to do because it doesn't matter what kind of controller you put in my hand. I suck at Mario Kart.
Yeah.
I was saying last episode that I consider myself a fairly skilled gamer. I am not great at racing games, and I have come to accept my limitations in Mario Kart, and it may just because my wife is better than me at it and is not... And she is not a gracious competitor, particularly in multiplayer Mario games. So, you know what? If I can feel cool with my beep beep, I'm holding the wheel and I'm racing my my Bowser on a dirt bike, then I'm happy. And I enjoy it. And really, isn't that what it's about?
That's true.
Enjoying the game.
But we can't really talk about peripherals and not mention the insanity that the 2000s brought us and the Guitar Hero and Beyond games. This idea of getting a peripheral that was legitimately a small guitar, and then in the coming years getting Rock Band and getting a full electronic drum set and bass guitar and microphone. Of which the USB microphone actually works as a USB microphone.
Well, why change the technology when it's already right there? And it's a very interesting thing because we haven't seen a toy for, let's be honest here, we like to put on airs. I mean, we have this podcast. We're buying toys, everybody. Yes. And a toy hasn't sold systems quite as hard since the days of Rob.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to forget that back in 1985, people were very gun shy about video games.
Yep.
And so to have something with this little goofy robot and tops that worked on only 2 games helped to sell units because it made it seem like more of a family toy that happened to play computer software. And then we now get these big plastic guitars that have this wonderful piece of, this is fun for the whole family.
Yeah.
And you don't have to worry about, well, what about the A button or the triangle? R2, what? Strum the little bar, push the color, follow the thing on screen. Super easy. It's Simon Says, but simpler. It's Simon Will Say.
Well, something that I also thought was very cool about the drum set for Rock Band is that they prove that more or less you can play, if you're playing the drums on Expert on Rock Band, you're playing the song on drums. A very basic version of the song on drums, but still playing the song on drums.
Absolutely.
Which I always thought was fascinating.
I found it fascinating, and I found it hilarious because the whole Guitar Hero, Rock Band, everything else exploded. A big piece of it was when I was in college.
Yeah.
And I was a music major. And I was in several bands. So it was always so fun. I mean, you bet we had Guitar Hero and Rock Band at least one house, and we were all playing it. And the first time when Rock Band had first come out, I was in a ska band because I studied trumpet, and so you're gonna end up in some ska bands.
See, kids, what ska was? No, I'm not even gonna bother because all the second and third wave ska people are just gonna yell at me because I'll get it wrong.
Yes, you are. To be fair, so will I. But the thing is, we went back to my buddy Greg's house. His roommate Marcos had the whole setup. We're playing it out, and our drummer Hugo, who is an absolutely fantastic drummer. And not just a fantastic drummer, a fantastic musician. Mm-hmm. You know, all the drummer jokes aside, he reads music. He would actually pull out drum charts when we would play live. It would get the laughs out of other bands, but then they'd hear what he could do. And then the first time he sat down to play the drum parts for Rock Band, oh my God, he was terrible.
Yeah.
Because it was just a new way of reading it. He eventually figured it out, and you're eventually playing the drums, and it's like, okay, yes, these skills translate, but you still have to teach yourself a whole new way, which then led into all those arguments with Rock Band and Guitar Hero. You know, you're not really playing the guitar. You don't think you're really musicians, do you? Right. I don't know why I've got this weird old man voice.
I don't know either. I mean, but it did also lead to games like Rocksmith, which still exist and still release new versions, where it turned your actual guitar into a controller for this game so you can learn to strum strings and play guitar.
Absolutely. And I would love at some point to take some time to, whether on this podcast or if I ever start making videos or anything like that, do an evolution of like, can we learn guitar with this? How like actually playing guitar is this?
Right, exactly.
From controller to Rock Band all the way to Rocksmith, because I've actually played around on Rocksmith. I do play guitar. It works in my experience, and in exactly that sense.
But plastic instruments aside, I think what's really cool about that generation of games is that it allowed us to look at peripherals very differently. I mean, peripherals has always been a business like you have the first-party versions of a controller for a system, the third-party versions in some cases which are better, in some cases are worse, and then, but that was just about it. But now with these controllers that were for these games, it also led to some interesting fun things I would do with the Guitar Hero controller. Like I once played Marvel vs. Capcom 3, I guess, was on the Xbox 360 with the guitar controller.
You did?
Which those buttons are mapped to other buttons. Now, I used the term played very loosely.
You interacted with Marvel vs. Capcom 3 using a Guitar Hero controller.
And, it doesn't really work. But then, like, we were talking about games done quick last week and, how you interact with those games. There are people who have played. I watched a video of someone playing not the Donkey Konga game on the N64, playing another game using the Donkey Kong controller.
I was on GameCube.
It was on GameCube, but he was trying to play a different game, not the game that peripheral was intended for, because technically the buttons existed on that controller.
It's a mapped input,
yeah, which is always very funny to me.
Oh yeah, well, Dance Dance Revolution pads are a very perennial piece for interactive input, or alternative input. We'll play a fighting game using that. I'm going to play a platforming game using this. I'm actually going to go this way and do that. I remember at PAX East this year, I saw a sort of dungeon crawler game that uses dance pads. Now, it was built around like a rhythm game style interface, but it was still a change in genre, which then runs into the downside of these things, because all those plastic instruments for Rock Band, they could sell your family on playing games. My father owns a PlayStation 3 entirely for Rock Band. And so I've played Beatles Rock Band with my father, and what a wonderfully fun thing. I don't think he and I have played video games together since Metal Gear on the NES for varying reasons. But then it's kind of, well, what about other games? And we've got all these big hunks of plastic. What are we going to do with them? And you either have to really work hard on it or you're in trouble. I mean, it's interesting you brought up Donkey Konga, because when they brought that out, that was the Donkey Kong game on the GameCube. Right. They came out with Donkey Konga before they came out with Donkey Kong Jungle Beat.
Right.
But they had already made those drums. They're first party. It's Nintendo. It's what we're doing with the property right now. Are we going to abandon those congas? No, we're going to make a platformer where you drum on them and clap.
Yeah.
So we're going to dig right in on that.
And the interesting thing that leads to, and I think the problem that the Wii sometimes had, was building a peripheral for a system or building games for a peripheral. And the idea, like, when all of us saw Wiimotes, we thought two things. It's a gun, it's a lightsaber. Those are the two things you thought as a nerd.
Because any stick you pick up is either going to be a gun or a lightsaber. I feel like that's a part of a personality test right there.
Pretty much. But I remember when they put out, I think it was a Clone Wars game, was one of the earlier Star Wars games. The lightsaber combat was terrible. And it made me realize, these peripherals are not meant for this. Even though they look like they should be, they're not. Or like, think about some of the more infamous peripherals of the modern gaming generation, the PlayStation Move and the Kinect. Like, I own a Kinect. Yeah, I own a Kinect for the 360. I never bought a Kinect for the 360.
Neither did I.
My friend Rob, who is a huge nerd, when the R2-D2 Xbox 360 came out with Star Wars Kinect, he bought it because he wanted an R2-D2 system. But then he would have two Kinects. So he's like, well, I can't sell the other Kinect for very much. Here, have a Kinect. And so I got one, and the only thing I ever really used it for was sometimes the voice commands when they worked right and swiping on my menus. But here's the thing about something like that is developed to be close to the TV, but is developed strangely or not fluidly, is I would use it to watch Netflix on my 360. which is what my 360 became towards the end of its life cycle, was a Netflix machine. But that said, I would say Xbox, open Netflix, and it would open Netflix. Then I'd say Xbox, play the Ninja Turtles movie, and it would play the Ninja Turtles movie. And then if one of the characters yells, stop, or hold it, we gotta pause, it would react. Because it would mistake my voice for the audio coming out of the TV and pause itself or stop itself. And it's like, really? Also, like, it had integrations for Mass Effect 3. That just meant you could yell at the screen for your characters to sometimes do a thing. It was not impressive.
Now, keeping that in mind, these are those sort of things that feel as though, man, this is what we've always wanted as gamers. How much of we, when we were little playing on the NES, did we lean one way or another to try to go one way? How much did we want to yell at the screen and make something happen? Now we got it.
And
now what?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and also the fact that with the Kinect, it's like, I want to relax when I'm playing a game. I don't want to run in circles and do jumping jacks and all this other stuff. Wii Sports was a lot of fun because, like Geoff said earlier, it was mini games. And the Wiimote worked best with mini games because you could trade off, take turns. And I'm all for that kind of stuff. It's why Rock Band was a success, is because you have 4 peripherals and then you're taking turns playing these instruments, or you're playing for 3 to 5 minutes on a song.
They were sessions.
Yeah. And I think that's where unique peripherals have their strength. Whereas, beyond that, I don't want to interact that long. I'd rather just be holding a controller. It's one of the greatest strengths, I think, about the 3DS and the Nintendo Switch, and I promise I'll talk about other systems besides Nintendo systems, is that you could turn off the 3D on the 3DS, and you can turn off the motion control on the Switch. So this has options that you can enjoy, but you don't have to. Whereas the Wiimote, you had to more or less always use it as a Wiimote.
Absolutely. I think most of us forget the Nintendo DS has a microphone.
Yeah.
We forget that. Mostly it was used to blow into, or if you really wanted your chatbot to say vulgar things in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl.
Yeah.
I know there were other uses for it, but that, Mario Party, blow up a balloon. But yeah, it was there. It wasn't necessary. It was very unobtrusive as well.
Right.
To have these as options is a wonderful thing. I think the only Kinect game I enjoyed playing was Kinect Disneyland. This was when some friends of mine had gotten a Kinect, and that's the game they had, and we would go over and visit them, and we'd take turns exploring Disneyland and interacting with the people in the park, and there'd be all the weird mini games of like, okay, how do we figure this out? And it'd be 1 or 2 of us at a time, and we would just rotate in and out, being like, all right, now I'm exploring Disneyland. Now I'm on the magic carpet. Now I'm going to go talk to Alice in Wonderland. And it was just a big, fun, goofy thing. But as a sustained, long gaming effort, and there are many different kinds of gaming experiences. There is the party game, and these peripherals are great for party games. Probably, you have on the one end, you've got, for large, obtrusive, and physically demanding or whatever consoles, you've got on the one end, you've got the Rock Band drum set.
Yeah.
It's large, it takes up a lot of space. You're not going to do long gaming sessions with it unless you're trying to complete like that Beatles every song in the discography challenge, which good luck. It exists.
It does.
And on the complete other end, Steel Battalion.
Oh, God.
Remember Steel Battalion?
I forgot about Steel Battalion. So Steel Battalion, for those who don't know, was a mech game for the Xbox that came with a cockpit. You literally bought a mech controller that more or less was the cockpit of the mech. It had a eject button. It had, buttons that fired missiles, or 2 joysticks. It was insane. It was the most insane controller I've ever seen.
It had it had several dozen input points. It had 2 joysticks. It had 3 pedals. Because the whole level of immersion within the game itself, if your mech was being destroyed, if you didn't eject out of it, your save file was erased and you had to start again.
Yeah.
Like, they gave you all of these points so that you could interact with it, and so that you would have all of these consequences for your actions. Now, as of right now, as of this moment, as I look at my phone, they do still sell Steel Battalion with controller, anywhere from $70 to $300, depending on these things. And they made 1 sequel, I believe. And you have to, that was all you had for interacting with this, frankly, proportionate behemoth. It wasn't as if you had your own full pod, but you definitely had like, you think people who have their own custom fight sticks are insane.
Yeah.
Oh, honey.
Well, and also the funny thing about Steel Battalion is that they did make one for the 360. However, there was no controller. Instead, it was the Kinect, and you had to interact with the interface on screen based on your movement. Problem is, if you've used the Kinect, it's less than accurate. So it ended up just creating this game that was incredibly frustrating to play, almost impossible to control. And I think it's interesting when you focus on the controls of the game to make a game. I mean, gameplay is important. But the idea of, I want to be in the room when they were discussing the first Guitar Hero, because that's what spawned all of the other peripherals. The idea that you want a controller that functions like a guitar. Whose idea was that? Who came up with it? I mean, I'm proud of the fact that in my marketing course in college, I created Billy Joel's Piano Man, which was in the era of Guitar Hero, and this idea that you would play a keyboard to play his songs. And lo and behold, many years later, Rock Band introduced with a later version a keyboard controller, which was essentially a tiny keytar.
Now, granted, a lot of the Red Octane instruments and everything that were made had a basis in Bamani games, the Konami line. While I've mentioned Dance Dance Revolution several times, they also had Guitar Freaks, Drum Mania, Keyboard Mania, Dance Maniacs, Beat Mania, Paradise, and the like. And that's just off of the first generation or so. And probably the only one that I think holds up in a sense would be Beat Mania, because it's sort of the DJ simulator, and Beat Mania 2DX, which is kind of the gold standard now, or kind of what everybody works with,
right,
is 7 buttons for samples and a turntable. Now, it's also not a very large controller. It's about the size of your average fight stick. So you can bring it places. You can keep it at home. I have a friend who imported a Japanese PS2 purely so he could play the really good Beatmania games. And again, it's not bigger than an old school PS2. So in terms of space, in terms of applicability, it's a game that has, granted, it's used to play Beatmania games.
Yeah.
But do you know how many Beatmania games there are? No, you don't. Check Wikipedia. You're probably wrong. I know I am. But it's also very funny because it is a proprietary controller. It's a Konami controller. And it's one that doesn't have sort of a shape precedent. Whereas GunCon games, you can make a gun game that is sort of compatible with the GunCon in the old PlayStation PS2 era, and that's all well and good. The Wiimote is something that okay, I want to make a point and shoot game, point and shoot, but something where you've got a little wheel that you turn, like the Atari paddle, and a couple of buttons there. Now, think about this for a minute. You could make a very interesting old style Breakout or side-to-side, vertical shoot-'em-up game using those controls. I always really liked the idea of, okay, you got to come with me on this one, everybody.
Here we go.
Who remembers Night Trap?
Oh, God.
Yes, Night Trap, that really heinous FMV game that came out for the Sega CD, and then later the Sega CD 32X, because the problem with that game was that it needed a slightly better resolution. But it was primarily setting up and moving some traps while going between different viewpoints. Now, if you've got something like the Beatmania controller, you've got yourself a really good Five Nights at Freddy's style controller where you are, the security guard going between the different points and viewing all of the different spots. And that is looking at one controller and being like, well, what are all the different things we can do with this? However, that is something of a happy medium of it's seems decently versatile because it's decently abstract and it's not gigantic.
Yeah.
These are the problems we run into. And it's not overly physical either. Many of the peripherals we've been discussing, many of the more exciting yet failed ones, demand a sustained physical effort from gamers.
Well, yeah, I think one of the biggest naysays about the Xbox in the early days with the controller was too big. It was just this huge honking round black controller that was hard to hold if you had normal human-sized hands and not mitts like I do.
The Duke, yes.
The Duke. So they engineered them down for later generations and made them smaller and then more streamlined. But, these kinds of problems came up with lots of systems. I mean, the original DS Lite and 3DS were also very small. And so a lot of people with large hands would complain about hand cramping, myself included. If you're playing a game for 2 hours and you have your hands kind of squished around it, it was uncomfortable. So when they made the XLs, they made them larger, made the buttons bigger, easier to hold. There have been similar complaints about the Switch, that the controllers are too small.
Absolutely. And these are the things that need to be taken into account in design. You know, we sitting where we sit can pass all kinds of judgment on design decisions and points, but it's very difficult to please all the people all of the time.
Yes.
And small decisions, small details, no pun intended, have a big impact, whether it's the size of the controller, the shape of things, and what you take from one design as you implement it into the next can have a very big impact. I mean, case in point, something that was pointed out to me not too long ago, and my brain is still wrapping around it. I don't know if I mentioned it on this podcast. I don't think so. So the N64 controller, the middle prong, has the joystick and the Z button.
Yep.
It is the exact same shape, proportion, size, everything to the Wii Nunchuck.
Oh, yeah. It's like if you plucked it off, it would be the Wii Nunchuck.
If it like modularly pulled right off, that's what you have. And it's sort of, well, that worked.
Yeah.
But that three-prong didn't quite. And so they kept something there that, yeah, frankly, works really well. And they haven't gotten rid of it. And it's sort of been adapted a bit into the Joy-Cons. But, you know, it's been phased out a little bit. But it got a good run there because they knew it worked.
Yeah, I think that ultimately, I think also we're past the point where controller comfort will deter people from playing a system. I think like back in the PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo era, which I guess at that point was GameCube, all of the controllers looked very different from each other. They had a basic similar scheme of shoulder buttons, face buttons, analog sticks. But beyond that, there were huge differences. But now as we get further along, like the Xbox 360 controller is fairly similar to a PS4 controller or PS3 controller.
Yeah.
The shape is just a little different. Like both analogs are on the bottom versus one analog high and one analog low. But beyond that, the buttons are fairly similar.
Oh, yeah. Well, every generation at the outset, they were adding more and more buttons.
Yeah.
And then it reached sort of a glass ceiling of, okay, you can only put so many buttons on here. Jaguar flew too close to the sun there.
Yeah.
And let's dial it back a little. And yeah, you're right. There is a certain assumed ergonomic comfort with controllers. If you are so used to playing games nowadays, even if you grew up playing an NES, but you've been playing, you got your PS4, you've got your Xbox One S and everything else, and you're playing, you go back and you pick up an NES controller. Ow!
Yeah, it's very awkward.
And we did it.
Yeah.
And it's not like I had to walk 15 miles uphill both ways to get to a good gaming experience, but it was just what was there and what was put forth and what we accepted.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea that Game Boy, for a very long time, was 4 buttons and 1 D-pad.
Yeah.
That's it. For a very, very long time. Even into the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color and all of that, it wasn't until we got the original DS that we got additional buttons and an extra screen.
Well, we got shoulder buttons with the Game Boy Advance.
That's right.
We got the XY buttons with the DS.
Yes.
So we finally fully caught up to the Super Nintendo in terms of number of buttons with the Nintendo DS.
Sure. And I mean, it's interesting because the Nintendo controllers very much refer to its past at some point or another. Or, like in later systems, like they released the classic controller for the Wii, which I mentioned before, which was very similar to a Super Nintendo controller. How the current Switch setup is very reminiscent of a Nintendo controller when it's held sideways, of a Super Nintendo controller when it's held a different way, like the Wiimotes when it's held a different way.
And it's also very funny, because we can have all of these historical precedents, we don't really think about how much thought goes into these designs, into the number of buttons, into the placement of buttons. I mean, think about the fact that we think of buttons in pairs in a lot of ways. You got your 2 analog sticks, you got your shoulder buttons, whether left and right, or L and R, or L1 R1, L2 R2, whatever. But Genesis and Saturn controllers were based on 3.
Yeah.
You'd use 3-button and your 6-button because they had an arcade mindset.
Yep.
And it's just the fact of we accept these designs as granted, whereas what's stopping us from having a 5-button face?
Right.
Sense, I suppose, or a certain ergonomic or a certain expectation. And I ran into that kind of thing where I've mentioned Dance Dance Revolution many times because I really like Dance Dance Revolution. I was a teenage mall rat and I played Dance Dance Revolution so much. I still have the pads. And the red octane foam ones too before they got into the whole Guitar Hero thing. And playing Pump It Up, it was a dance game that used the exact inverse buttons. Yeah. Whereas Dance Dance Revolution had up, down, left, right, or forward, back, left, right, however you want to think about it. And the Pump It Up was the diagonals and a center button, which made for some really interesting spin moves and some cool stuff and whatever else. But it threw me off so very badly. And the fact is, why not?
Yeah,
why not have those?
Well, it's like going back to you mentioning Sega Genesis. Like, I was the kid who bought a Genesis before he bought a Super Nintendo. And so getting a 3-button controller for games like Sonic and other things, it was great.
Made perfect sense.
But once I got my first Street Fighter game on the Genesis, and I only had a 3-button controller, and you had to press the select button to swap between fierce, essentially high kick, low kick, that was weird to me, and I hated it. But then as soon as they released the smaller, more ergonomic 6-button controllers, it was a dream for fighting games on Genesis because playing games like Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo was so much easier, whereas on Super Nintendo it was actually very awkward because you had a 6-button setup, but it was 4 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons instead of the 3 buttons across the way on the face. 2 rows of 3.
You learn to adapt, but it's not as intuitive as you'd think.
Right, and so I loved that for the Genesis. But yeah, beyond fighting games, it was fairly pointless. Like in Sonic, you had a jump button and another jump button and a third jump button. That was it.
How far would you like to move your thumb for jumping? How far? And it's a funny thing. And so you have to look at, well, for what mindset are these games are these controllers being developed? What style of game? I feel Sega, from its very beginnings in the console world, certainly from Genesis, the Mega Drive onward, were about the arcades.
Yeah.
And their design and their mindset was reflected in their controllers and their peripherals, which also made for some really bad peripherals.
Sure. But I mean, I feel like the Dreamcast controller, first of all, is the precursor to probably the Xbox controller.
Yes, it is.
But also was surprisingly comfortable, even though it was one of the ugliest controllers.
Yes, and that's one of those big, looks aren't everything. It looks ugly as sin, but you hold it in your hands and it just feels so right.
Well, and also like I forget what the memory cards were called.
The VMU.
The VMUs was a brilliant bit of technology that was way too early for its time. I mean, you look at games like Crazy Taxi and Sonic Adventure and House of the Dead and all of these games that came out on the Dreamcast that were incredible games for their time and controlled really well and did awesome functions with the VMU, which then became a tiny little portable game you could play.
And Sony tried to do the same thing with the Pocket Station, but they never brought it over to America.
Yeah, but the thing is that Sega had something that was really great, but just because of timing and finances, it tanked. Had that system come out in the era of the N64/GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation, it would have been a contender. But it didn't. It came out much earlier than that and fell flat. Because the games are so expensive, the system was expensive, and it was unfortunate because I think it sold okay, but essentially it was the system that killed the company.
Well, Dreamcast came out at the end of a series of losses of faith with the market, and people were waiting out the PlayStation 2's release. So it was there were a lot of unfortunate things, and more learned, researched voices than ours have spoken at length about them, and we'll probably speak about them in the future as we become more researched.
For sure.
But you're absolutely right, and it's a very funny thing to look at some of these control schemes, control ideas, and some of them are before their time, some of them are after their time, some of them are sort of ahead of the design philosophy.
Sure.
Because we are in an age where there's a lot of motion control that can happen.
Yeah.
But as people realize that nobody wants a sustained motion control scheme,
Right.
you're not exactly going to get away with, you're going to find fewer and fewer games that are designed with that in mind. You're going to find more games that have, little mini games or like little moments of you're playing, all of a sudden do this thing.
Yeah.
The PlayStation Vita is a system that is composed of several potential gimmicks.
Right.
There's not one but two touchscreens. It has motion control. It has two cameras. It has all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. And you can choose to turn those things on and off. Batman Arkham Origins Blackgate on PS Vita, your hacking minigame in finding all of the passwords and whatnot, you can either choose to use the joystick to move it back and forth and figure it out, or because it's all on a screen of like random letters and numbers, and it's sort of like, oh, you found that correct one, and now the next one, and it's a waste of time, whatever. You can use the cameras and motion control, and you can sit there and kind of move it around as if you were holding a little hacking device. Mm-hmm. And there's something very unique and fun about that, and you don't need to ever shake the thing or like tap like mad for Batman to fight anybody. It plays like a side-scrolling or like a 2.5D brawler.
Right.
And it's a lot of fun. And then there are those moments of, now you get to be Batman. Yeah. Are you going to hack the lock? Let's move it around and find it. And it feels so cool. Those little bursts, those little things are a lot of fun. And then again, if you are going for an arcade style philosophy, I keep mentioning fight sticks. I keep mentioning people having their own arcade control setup. There is a good feeling in that. And that's something that it doesn't mean that you have to suddenly wiggle and flail the thing around. It doesn't mean you have extra buttons that you have to flip up and flick to move your mech around. It doesn't mean you have to cast the line like it's some kind of PS1 rod and reel controller that actually exists.
Actually exists.
It is just simply a modification or a refinement of your interaction with the game itself.
Yeah.
And again, people are going to argue forever. Fight sticks, controllers,
keyboard and mouse.
Keyboard and mouse. VR headset. And that's a whole nother thing where I would love to talk about VR in a future episode, but I don't have much firsthand information on interacting with VR yet. And it's still in its infancy in terms of making a good controller experience.
Yeah, I've used the HTC Vive, and when I'm using it, it feels very intuitive, but it's a little disorienting. I don't own one, so I'm not super experienced, but I did like Job Simulator and one of the adventure games on it, and it's definitely a cool piece of tech that to me feels more like tech and less like a game. But I think that they could do some interesting things with it. I think innovating how we interact with games is always going to change and vary because gaming is about interaction. That's the goal. And so it's always going to change and shake things up. And I think that's what's really fascinating about peripherals in general and the evolution of them is that it changes how we experience gaming. And like for me, when in doubt, I will often prefer to not have motion control. But I will admit, the first time I played Twilight Princess and I fired the bow by holding the nunchuck and pulling back the Wiimote was pretty damn cool. My aim was terrible, but it felt pretty cool.
And I'm going to continue to lose at Mario Kart holding the steering wheel. That's just how I enjoy the game. And as games evolve, as control schemes evolve, what works is going to be held on to, and what doesn't is going to be forgotten, maybe to be rediscovered at a better time. And it all just kind of becomes a piece of, we don't have 3-button controllers as much anymore. We don't have 6-button controllers, not in the same way.
Yeah.
But motion control has been tried since the NES era, the Power Glove.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's back and it works better now. And is it in everything? No, but the design philosophy takes these things into account, and there's a great true evolution. What works stays, what doesn't falls away. And it's not a perfect system, but it's really interesting to see some of the stuff that's come in the meantime.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, my litmus test for Nintendo controllers has really been Smash Brothers since the original. And the best control scheme I found from N64 to GameCube to Wii to Wii U to soon the Switch so far sticks with the GameCube controller. I feel it's still the tightest way to control a game. In fact, what's interesting about peripherals is you get so used to using a certain kind of controller that you could be in the weeds when you are given something else. Like I had the GameCube adapter for the
The Wii U.
For the Wii U, when I would play it with my friends at my job, we had that adapter. But my nephew had Smash Brothers on the Wii U and no adapter, so I had to use a Wiimote because he was using the screen controller. I was so lost. I was like relearning how to play a game I'd known my whole life, and it was really bizarre. Eventually, I adapted and still whooped him because I'm a gamer with experience. But it's one of those things that I feel like. And I spoke a little bit about this earlier. My favorite controller for a long time was the N64 controller for shooters because it did have that 3-prong setup that felt natural. Essentially gave birth to the Xbox controller, which did perfect it.
All right. And, well, let me ask. Is the N64 your favorite controller?
No, it's not. I would have to say that my favorite controller, I think, based on experience and design, it's tough. I think the 360 is probably it. I really love the GameCube controller, but the fact that it only has the one analog stick, because the C-stick doesn't really count as an analog stick.
Yeah, not as much.
Made certain shooters hard to control and certain perspective games hard to control, even if they weren't shooters. The 360 controller really does have the right distance between the analog sticks. The D-pad is still comfortable to use. The button setup is very comfortable. The shoulder buttons work really well. I think it's definitely the most versatile multi-purpose controller. It's what I use for PC gaming. Whereas I think in the new generation, I do like the Switch controller, but I think I like the Switch controller because I like other Nintendo controllers. I don't think it's the best. I think of the controllers I've ever used, this 360 controller still seems the most versatile and comfortable.
And I'm not asking best, I'm asking favorite.
Right.
So there you go. Whereas I go between the PS2 and the PS3. A lot of it is experience. A lot of it is familiarity. The PS2 controller works on PS1 games.
Yeah.
So that's where most of my collection lies, PS1 and PS2. So I play a lot of those games. And I enjoy the PS3 controller. I enjoy having a wireless controller. There's something very freeing about that. And there's something kind of fantastic about the sort of the gradients of the shoulder buttons, the R2 and L2 buttons on the PS3 controller. However, I have a PS3 controller that I use when I Twitch stream on my computer, and I find myself more often than not, if I'm like resting the controller on the table or on my lap or on something like that, I find myself accidentally pressing that controller a lot more often. So
right.
I suppose I'll have to stick with the PS2 controller. I'm not saying it's perfection. I'm not saying it's the most amazing ever. I'm just saying it's my favorite. And if you had to give me one to interact with the widest range of games, I'd take a PS2 controller.
All right. Tell us what your favorite controllers are. I think we've hit all of the notes of the most bizarre ones, like your Weird Instruments and Steel Battalion. But if there's one we missed, please let us know. But
please send pictures as well.
Yes, please. We will add them to our fan collection folder that I've just made up. And that's another thing I, too, want to bring up at the end as we're talking about peripherals and talking about gaming and collecting and having stuff. We've shared a lot of photos of mostly Geoff's collection of stuff because it's way more impressive than mine. But if you have controller collections, game collections, anything relating to gaming that you're impressed with your collection or just want to share what you have, please post pictures on our Facebook page. Please tweet them at us. We would love to see it. But also, tell us what your favorite controllers are. Because I think Geoff is right. Your personal experience with a controller and what you're comfortable with will determine what is your favorite. Like for me, the fact that I use my 360 controller for 360, for PC, I use it across multiple platforms, made it more versatile to me, whereas he's using the PlayStation controllers, which you can do just as easily.
Absolutely. When I found out that the PS3 controller doesn't require any extra jiggering to anything extra to connect on Bluetooth to a Mac, that was it for me.
Whereas I have a PC, so I need a dongle no matter what, and 360 had sold dongles for their controllers for a long time, and so it just was natural for me to use it for a PC.
And those are just our experiences, and we would love to hear yours as well.
Of course, you can find us anywhere you can find Fun and Games Pod on the internet. It's our Facebook, it's our Twitter, it's our Instagram. We are funandgamespod@gmail.com. Please check us out there. I've recently been streaming, and Geoff plans to do more streaming too on our individual twitch.tv channels. If there are any games you'd like to see us live stream or play together, shoot us a suggestion. A game you think we'd enjoy that we've never played before. We'd love to hear that as well.
It's always about new experiences or reliving some old ones and sharing them with new people. We always appreciate you coming in to listen with us, and thank you so much, everybody. I'm Geoff Moonen,
I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
and happy gaming.